Entire shipwrecks have been disappearing from the ocean floor across Southeast Asia. A wave of illegal scrap metal salvage is now regarded as the largest known incident of war grave robbery in history. Countless war graves have been destroyed in widespread crime and corruption that is believed to be ongoing. Southeast Asia was the historic stage of dramatic battles between the Allied forces and the Japanese during World War II. Warships from the Netherlands, England, Australia, as well as the US and Japan, are now the resting places of thousands of sailors and crewmen who lost their lives.
There's a lot of reverence for the men of war who died on the wreck if it was a war grave. Human remains, we see them, we don't touch them.
Most of the fallen sailors in these war graves have lain in peace for more than 75 years. Until now.
I didn't really recognize it as a bomb, but as I went further down, there were a lot of wires running all over the place. Then it occurred to me that, oh my God, they've been blasting the wrecks.
Global headlines have declared it the world's biggest grave robbery.
Kerja-kerja dorang belum berhenti, masih dalam progres. Masih lagi menjalankan aktiviti mereka.
We all know that this is not the research. This is stealing the underwater heritage. So I was really pissed off.
Kalau lagi ngebersihin, ditemukan ada bekas tulang-tulang, ada tengkorak segala macam.
An investigation was launched to uncover who destroyed these underwater war graves and why. This video is made possible by Audible. Thank you for checking out History X. Recently, I was shocked to learn that World War II shipwrecks have been disappearing from the floor of the Pacific Ocean adjacent to Southeast Asia. A wave of illegal scrap metal salvage can arguably be regarded as the largest known war grave robbery in history. Graves have been stripped, dredged, and destroyed, and it appears this atrocity continues to this day. Okay, here's a little background. I decided to create this video after watching a documentary I first saw on the Channel News Asia show called CNA Insider. I was shocked to say the least. And after watching this, I think History X viewers will be shocked as well. Channel News Asia did a great job bringing the subject to the forefront. The original documentary is close to an hour long, and if you want to see the whole thing, I'll have a link to it in the description to this video below. However, as most History X viewers know, I want specifics. So I couldn't simply repost the CNA video content. That is why it is my voice you'll hear narrating, because in creating this video, I decided to focus on the points I felt were most important, yet lacked key detail and required further explanation. I want to stress much of the imagery and video footage you will see is from the CNA Insider investigative documentary, Shipwreck Robberies. At Brondong Port, on the east coast of Java, in Indonesia, scrap metal workers dismantle a decommissioned cargo ship. Not far from here, beginning in 2016, local police launched an investigation into ongoing reports of human remains. The bones were reportedly found in piles of metal scrap that had been salvaged from a shipwreck. These events quickly grabbed the attention of an aggressive local journalist, a guy by the name of Aquam Hanapan.
Banyak kabar berhembus bahwa kemana besi ini gitu. Kemudian atasan saya meminta saya untuk melakukan reportase datang ke Jawa Timur untuk menginvestigasi apa sih sebetulnya yang terjadi di Surabaya.
A Dutch shipwreck dating to World War II is believed to be the source of the human remains.
Nah, dari Google Earth itu saya bisa tahu bahwa dalam waktu antara 2014 sampai 2017 awal, bahwa lokasi ini memang jadi salah satu dumping area untuk memotong besi-besi bangkai kapal yang diambil dari Laut Jawa.
Here we see video from an unnamed scrapyard worker that decided to take out his mobile phone and begin recording.
Kalau misalkan kita lihat video dari salah seorang pekerja yang bekerja di sini, kita kan bisa melihat bahwa ada banyak sekali puing-puing yang dikumpulkan di area sini. Ketika saya ngobrol, diketahuilah informasi bahwa ternyata yang mengambil bangkai kapal itu ternyata bukan mereka, tapi diambil oleh satu perusahaan besar dengan teknologi yang sangat tidak lazim dilakukan di Indonesia, dan teknologi ini tidak semua orang mempunyai itu gitu.
The Battle of the Java Sea unfolded in the waters just off the shores of Brondong in Indonesia. On the 27th of February, 1942, a coalition of Allied ships fought a fierce surface battle against the Japanese Imperial Navy. The Allies would eventually lose at least 8 battleships. It's one of the worst naval defeats of World War II. Among those that were lost from the British fleet, HMS Electra, HMS Exeter, and from the Dutch Navy, HNLMS Java, De Ruyter, and Kortenaer, all went down with heavy casualties.
The scrap metal from these Dutch shipwrecks, that there were human remains in the scrap metal, that there was a smell of charred flesh as they were cutting through it. This is what the local Indonesian workers were reporting, and it was widely reported in the media, and of course it caused international outrage and condemnation, particularly in the Netherlands.
Dr. Natalie Pearson has been studying the criminal salvage of these World War II shipwrecks for years, and she has been closely monitoring the situation in Brondong.
What they wanted to find out was they wanted to investigate the source of the removal, who'd done this and why. They also wanted to determine whether these allegations of human remains in the scrap metal were legitimate.
The legal status of shipwrecks far out to sea is very complex. For any investigation, the first challenge is determining whether or not a crime has even been committed. In 1942, when the Battle of the Java Sea took place, Indonesia was still a Dutch colony. It was the Dutch East Indies. Let's face it, there were no concentrations of shipwrecks like this in the area. Therefore, there was no need for laws prohibiting the robbing or looting of shipwrecks. No one saw anything like this coming. But ultimately, it comes down to the Indonesian authorities to decide whether a crime has been committed. Local journalists began conducting their own investigation to help authorities determine whether or not a crime had been committed. They interviewed scrap iron workers to find out if they knew the source of the scrap metal. They discovered knowledge of the shipwreck salvage operations appears to be widespread in the community.
Jadi kita sekarang datang ke rumahnya salah satu pekerja di area pengumpulan besi-besi bekas itu. Tugasnya dia jadi untuk motong-motongin besi. Oke, bisa sana, Mas, maaf. Banyak juga Mas ya. Ini ada yang lihat nggak Mas? Besi-besi ini aja. Dulu dapetin ini di mana, Mas?
Waktu kita belah kapal dulu yang di Brondong itu.
Kapal. Mas ingat nggak Mas kapal-kapalnya Mas yang ini ngebelah apa
yang
gitu?
Ini ngebelah kapal, ada kapal perang kan. Waktu kapal perang kan kita cuma tahu itu kapal perang kan ada kayak gini, ada peluru, terus ada semacam meriam, ada. Terus ini sama juga, ini kayaknya kapal perang.
Oke. Ini kapal perang juga. Landrum ini kamar ya bahasa. Apa Mas? Kamar ya landrum C. Bahasa Belanda.
Hampir 50 orang nggak salah itu. Kan ada bagian-bagian kan, ada yang pemborong, ada 3 pemborong kan waktu itu. Kalau truk besar sekitar ada 3 atau 4 ya. Kalau kecil-kecil banyak, kecil-kecil itu sekitar ada 8 atau 10 ya.
Sehari?
Iya.
Non-stop itu?
Non-stop.
Banyak banget berarti besinya ya?
Banyak. Kan sampai gunung kan waktu itu. Banyak banget.
Ini sangat penting soalnya karena si pegawai ini dia yang ada di lokasi dumping area. Jadi fungsinya vital sekali, vital dalam artian dia tahu betul jenis besi, terus apa aja yang diambil, apakah itu dari kapal kargo, kapal perang atau apapun itu.
As more witnesses came forward, local journalists found one man who worked as a metal cutter at one of the scrap dumping grounds. He claims he saw the human remains and knows exactly what took place.
Itu kerjaan saya ya cuma ngawasi aja, terus habis itu nyediain logistik buat pekerja-pekerjanya. Itu setahu saya diambilnya dari tengah laut, pakai nggak tahu apa namanya itu kapal yang ada besinya gitu untuk ngambil. Terus sebetulnya macam-macam itu barang-barang bangkai-bangkai kapalnya itu kayaknya macam-macam, cuma itu kayak ditemukan ada beberapa mirip dengan kayak meriam. Terus habis itu ada juga yang ada ini loh, apa mas? Plakatnya itu ada tulisannya pakai bahasa asing. Yang nggak tahu itu bahasa apa, bahasa Inggris, bahasa Belanda atau bahasa mana, aku nggak tahu.
It's the best testimony so far that local reporters have, pointing directly to illegal work being done on these war graves. But the questions still remain. What happened to the bones that were found? And which company or salvage vessel is to blame?
Kalau lagi ngebersihin atau mengangkat itu, bekas yang diangkat-angkat itu ya ditemukan ada juga yang ditemukan ada bekas tulang-tulang, ada tengkorak segala macam.
This video is made possible by Audible. Headlines declared it the world's biggest grave robbery. Dozens of World War II shipwrecks have gone missing from the seafloor in Southeast Asia. Dave Yu is a seasoned deep-sea diver and explorer of many Southeast Asian shipwrecks. Over the years, Dave has witnessed firsthand the ongoing destruction of historical shipwrecks on the seafloor.
The thing about shipwrecks is the attraction to the history of it, where this wreck came from, especially if it's a war wreck. All right, from World War I, World War II, there's a lot of reverence for the men of war who died on the wreck if it was a war grave. Human remains, we see them, we don't touch them.
Dave's knowledge of the shipwrecks north of Singapore shows just how widespread this problem has become. And the many hours he's spent exploring these huge World War II wrecks, it's become an obsession.
Diving the wrecks was just pure ecstasy for me. Every dive, I can't even recall how many dives I did on the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, and the amount of things that I saw, you know, the historical value of this wreck, and just trying to imagine what life was on board when she was in commission. But now all that is gone.
December 10th, 1941. Two huge British battle cruisers, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, are sent north of Singapore into battle. After narrowly avoiding the Japanese Navy, the ships are spotted by a plane, and soon a force of 85 twin-engine bombers launch wave after wave of attacks, with the final strikes coming from torpedoes. It was the first time a modern warship moving at high speed was sunk from air attack alone. 840 officers and men lost their lives aboard the two ships, while more than 2,000 managed to narrowly escape. Since then, the shipwrecks have become international attractions for highly trained deep-sea divers and are revered war graves.
The HMS Repulse, the Prince of Wales. These are the two wrecks that I visited very, very often over 2 decades of wreck diving.
While diving on HMS Repulse on a trip he organized nearly 10 years ago, in 2013, Dave noticed something very unusual.
During that particular trip, when I ventured off to the stern of the Repulse, I realized that one of her propellers, we were talking about a huge propeller bigger than the size of a bus, is missing. She's gone. We used to see the small-time salvages and they just dive off for scrap metal, but this is something else altogether. And then over the years, we saw more and more of this. We even saw the actual boats that were doing the demolition before the actual salvage barges came by to pick up the pieces.
This was carefully planned, large-scale targeting of huge warships, sometimes reaching 250 meters or 820 feet in length. A ship that size, there was more than enough steel to keep the operation going for years.
The salvagers, they had a standard pattern. They will send a fishing boat, a trawler, quite heavy-duty trawler, that could actually take heavy weather. We've seen them jump off.
The salvage divers used surface-supplied air hoses designed for deep water industrial work rather than scuba tanks. The shallowest point of the HMS Repulse sits 50 meters or 150 feet down. That's like taking an elevator 13 floors underwater. At this depth, any untrained diver is risking their life every time they enter the sea.
They will send one or maybe two divers down and then starts to plant all the charges. And we found wires running all the way up to the surface. So they would do all the positioning of the charges. They run this cheap telephone kind of wire all the way up to the surface, and then they charge it from the surface. The first time that I actually saw charges on Rex, which is the HMS Repulse, I didn't really recognize it as a bomb. But as I went further down, there were a lot of wires running all over the place. Then it occurred to me that, oh my God, they've been blasting the Rex.
The salvage divers must leave the water prior to detonation.
You can't charge it when the diver's in the water. The diver will die, right? Because of the explosion and the impact, the sonic impact.
Next, a barge with a crane would come in to replace the trawler, and then the crew brings up the pieces one by one. In the case of the HMS Repulse, after the propellers were removed, the salvagers began targeting specific areas of the ship's hull.
When we were on the Repulse once, I remember very, very clearly we were on the decompression bar just below the boat, and suddenly there was this loud boom and I could feel it in my chest. Because that kind of impact can actually stop your heart. It felt like it was really close by.
The suspicion at the time was that the salvagers had moved to the HMS Prince of Wales, just 8 nautical miles away, where they continued blasting.
When they blast open the hull is to access the engines. Especially with the HMS Repulse, she was upside down, so where the cooling intakes were, they'll drop all the charges and they'll just blast everything out. So the rack will open up, her belly will open up, and they will have some more charges around to open up further so that they can hoist up the engine. And then within months, the other parts started disappearing as well. It was devastating. It's really devastating.
It's difficult to estimate how much of the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse remains. Many years have passed since a reliable survey has been conducted.
We can compare the destruction of these World War II shipwrecks to a bulldozer ripping through the earth. But because this destruction is taking place underwater, hidden beneath the waves, we haven't seen the sustained, widespread level of outcry that we would if something like this were happening on land.
Investigative journalist Akwam Hanafan continues to gather testimony from local scrapyard workers.
Kalau lagi ngebersihin atau mengangkat itu bekas yang diangkat-angkat itu ya ditemukan ada juga yang ditemukan ada bekas tulang-tulang, ada tengkorak segala macam. Sebagian itu dibuang lagi ke laut. Nah, tapi sebagian itu ya ada yang dikumpulin terus dibawa ke pemakaman di desa Sedayu Lawas ini di pemakaman Soko itu. Ya udah ditaruh dimakamin di situ.
Akwam has been sharing his information with the police from the start of its investigation. The only problem is the police fail to take these claims of war grave robberies seriously.
Menurut pengakuan Mas Agus gitu, dulu memang tulang, tapi kan indikasinya tulang apa kan nggak tahu karena apa, itu kan bagi kapal yang dibelah setelah itu kan ada. Pada waktu diambil itu ya kita ngomong-ngomong sama anggota-anggota gitu, itu kemungkinan enggak tulang manusia, tulang hewan, karena kecil.
Hewan warna apa Mas?
Nah, di situ kan banyak toh, kadang ada anjing, ada anjing apa namanya? Kucing yang meninggal di situ kan lama, akhirnya ada orang dikubur di situ kan bisa juga.
The official conclusion made by the police is the remains found in the local cemetery could not be of World War II sailors dredged up along with the shipwrecks. Rather, they draw a more unlikely conclusion. The remains were more likely to have been from small animals, pets.
Setelah laporan investigasi saya naik, sebetulnya kan pihak pemerintah kan langsung mengirim tim untuk mengambil sampel di pemakaman tersebut. Tapi hasil sampel tersebut menyatakan bahwa itu sebagai tulang hewan. Menurut saya itu yang sangat mengganjal karena nggak logis sekali gitu kalau misalkan bukan culture di Indonesia mengkubur tulang hewan di pemakaman manusia. Gitu.
So the conclusion of this investigation was that these were likely to actually be animal remains. Having said that, of course, with the removal of the shipwrecks from the seabed floor, the human remains of all those sailors who lost their lives in the Battle of the Java Sea have been disturbed, and that is something that we can't walk away from. It is very upsetting for the survivors and the descendants of those battles. Whether or not they're in Brondong is another question.
I'm standing here on the USS Croker here at the Buffalo Naval Park, so I thought it'd be the perfect time to tell you guys about Audible audiobooks. And I'm talking about books like Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by Hornfisher, Craig DeLuise' Crash Dive series if you're into submarines. If you have always had this wish list of books that you've wanted to read but you never have gotten to them, Audible makes it easy to cross these books off your list. Whether you listen to it in your car, I like to listen to audiobooks right before I go to bed. Definitely check out the offer that Audible has for you guys in the description of this video below. As these illegal scrap metal operations have been dredging historic shipwrecks from the seafloor across Southeast Asia, and in the process destroying thousands of war graves, there is a major question yet to be answered. It's one thing to salvage a retired ship for scrap metal on shore, above the water. It's quite another to dive down, blast open these World War II shipwrecks, and then send heavy equipment dredging barges to winch up the pieces. So why go through the additional expense and effort? Marine archaeologists in Sydney believe the reason is tied directly to the atomic bomb.
This large-scale salvage hasn't occurred on this scale ever. And it's a good question about why they're doing this salvage now. There has been discussion that the metals on these vessels were sunk prior to the atmospheric testing of atomic and hydrogen bombs in the late 1940s.
Since the testing and detonation of nuclear bombs, the entire planet has been contaminated with trace amounts of radiation known as fallout. As a result, all steel created after World War II has been slightly radioactive, and it is known as low background steel or pre-bomb or pre-war steel.
With these historic shipwrecks that are pre-bomb, so they sank before the first atomic explosion, the metal that they were forged with, of course, doesn't have that background radiation, doesn't have that radiation contamination. And metals that don't have that contamination are incredibly valuable because they can be used in sensitive equipment, so things like Geiger counters, photonics, aeronautical instruments, equipment that might be used in clean rooms or in space, for example. It's high value, and it's rare now because of all the radiation that's in the atmosphere. So one theory that we have is that these shipwreck sites might be targeted for that because they are a resource for that. And it makes more sense because otherwise, why would you go to the trouble to do it?
These metals have been shielded by the ocean from taking on radioactive isotopes. So there is a high value for the scrap steel, the scrap iron, if I can call it that, on the seabed. Far more than what you would normally get for normal scrap steel and iron.
HMAS Perth was the 170-meter or 560-foot long pride of the Australian Navy, but she was sunk by Japanese forces off the coast of Western Java, about 6 kilometers or 4 miles offshore. Dr. Hosty and Dr. Hunter know HMAS Perth extremely well.
We were given permission to dive on HMAS Perth in May 2017. And when we got down onto the seabed, onto the wreck itself, we realised that Perth had been absolutely devastated by this salvage operation.
We realized immediately that something was very wrong. It didn't look like the photos and the footage we had seen of the wreck prior to the salvage. There was a lot of twisted metal, nothing recognizable, no turrets, no superstructure, none of the things that we would have expected to encounter on this warship.
Using sonar research tools and over the course of numerous dives, the team of local and international marine archaeologists estimate that 60% of the once enormous and iconic ship is now gone.
This was salvage on a huge scale. This was conducted by a commercial diving operation. They would have had commercial divers or very well sophisticated divers operating on the site. So they would have used crane barges. They would have used all this sort of material to extract over 4,000 tonnes of HMAS Perth from the seabed. A massive undertaking.
UNESCO is short for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It's an agency of the United Nations that, in 2010, under what they call item number 11 of their constitution, decreed to protect cultural and heritage assets. So when it comes to the legal status of World War II shipwrecks, they are to be considered protected objects under that international agreement. Okay, great. Now, who is going to enforce that agreement? Further, if you look at what has been happening in these waters, local communities or government officials like those in Indonesia, they're beginning to push back, saying, hey, these shipwrecks do not belong to us. They do not belong to Indonesia. Rather, they are British, Australian, Dutch, Japanese, and American shipwrecks. Why are we expected to protect shipwrecks from other countries, lying in international waters, which don't belong to our country? And finally, whenever someone sounds the alarm and an investigation begins, it's often too late. The shipwrecks have already been looted.
But I would suggest that Indonesia has been unfairly accused of failing to protect and preserve these sites. Ultimately, the vessels were in these waters to defend colonial interests, and there has been limited cooperation over the past 75 years between the allied countries that were involved and Indonesia.
This video is made possible by Audible. If you guys have had a wish list of books you've wanted to read, check out the offer that Audible has for you guys in the description of this video below. Headlines declared it the world's biggest grave robbery. Dozens of World War II shipwrecks have gone missing from the seafloor in Southeast Asia. Investigative journalist Aquam Hanafan continued his search for the company responsible for disturbing these human remains from historical shipwrecks. He's interviewed dozens of locals, including a key eyewitness to the destruction of a Dutch Navy ship from World War II.
Itu kapal yang buat ngambil bangkai-bangkai kapal itu yang di tengah laut itu ya itu. Gede Mas. Kapalnya itu ya tulisannya tuh berapa ada tulisannya. Iya, kalau nggak salah itu Pioner 88. Ya.
With the ship's name, Piona 88, finally revealed, Aquam is able to trace the ownership of the vessel to a locally owned company, a company called PT Jatim Perkasa. He tracks down their headquarters and attempts to speak with the registered owner, which goes nowhere. What's worse, turning this evidence over to law enforcement also goes nowhere.
Pak, aku pengen tanya dong Pak sedikit aja yang soal kasus dulu kita tanganin tuh loh Pak, yang kita ngobrol-ngobrol itu Pak, yang soal PT Jatim Perkasa itu ada update-nya nggak sih Pak?
Saya nggak bisa karena tidak bisa dibuktikan dia melakukan pelanggaran, ya waktu itu kita hentikan proses lidiknya. Karena apa? Barang temuan itu tidak ada seperti baju sebesar itu nggak ada. Didukung dengan berita acara hasil pengangkatan itu. Terus titik koordinat juga berbeda. Jadi kita bicarakan fakta di lapangan waktu itu, Mas.
Any company running marine salvage operations in Indonesia requires permits. But it becomes pretty clear that government permits really mean nothing.
Perbedaan TKP istilahnya itu. Dari situ kita nyimpulkan bahwa kegiatan yang PT Jatim Perkasa itu bukan di tempat lokasi kapal itu, kan gitu. Jadi nggak bisa kita tarik benang merah bahwa dia pelakunya karena tidak cukup bukti kan waktu itu. Jadi kita juga tidak berani menyalahkan orang kalau belum ada bukti kuat kan gitu. Jadi kata kunci Mas Ikhwan, karena beda koordinat, saya nggak bisa nyimpulkan bahwa dia pelaku gitu. Itu aja kata.
Ini adalah izin yang dikeluarkan dari pemerintah untuk Pioner 88 tahun 2015. Lokasinya cukup dekat dengan HMS Electra yang bangkainya sekarang sama sekali tidak tersisa. Yang kedua, kalau misalkan kita melihat surat-surat izin perintah kerja yang dikeluarkan oleh Kementerian Perhubungan, hampir kebanyakan izin-izin yang diberikan kepada kapal Pioner 88 ini tidak mencantumkan koordinat. Nah, jadi kita bisa lihat bahwa khususnya untuk Pioner 88 oleh mereka tidak dijelaskan koordinat mana sebetulnya bangkai kapal apa saja yang harus diambil.
Could this distinct lack of detail in the permit be interpreted as a blank slate to salvage any ship in the area?
Ya, tentu saja sih itu akan menjadi dalih mereka untuk mengambil bangkai kapal yang tidak mestinya mereka ambil. Dan pengakuan si nelayan mengatakan bahwa ketika mereka beroperasi itu, terkadang mereka beroperasi di luar titik koordinat izin yang mereka dapatkan. Kadang mereka bekerja di luar, kadang mungkin bergeser cukup jauh dari alur itu.
In May 2017, Indonesian police issue an arrest warrant for the MV Chuan Hong 68, suspected of illegal metal salvage of warships. The 120-meter or 400-foot-long barge escapes Indonesian police and flees to Malaysia. But they didn't get far, and the entire crew is arrested.
Kami akan melanjutkan proses hukum terhadap kapal Chuan Hong 68 melalui koordinasi dengan Bapak Kapolri dan Bapak Kepala Staf TNI Angkatan Laut.
The MV Chuan Hong 68 is suspected of destroying at least a half dozen historical shipwrecks, including 3 Japanese World War II shipwrecks, the Kokoshi Maru, the Higani Maru, and the Hiyoshi Maru. The Japanese imperial ships were sunk in 1944.
That shipwreck is a very familiar place for my family. I mean, my father, my mom. We go fishing every weekend, and then we will do some dive over there.
Scuba diver and conservationist Monica Chen was notified by friends that something was happening at the beloved dive site. They sent her a video of an anchored barge working above the shipwreck.
Kerja-kerja dorang belum berhenti, masih dalam progress. Masih lagi menjalankan aktiviti mereka.
And on that day, it's very sad. I called all my friends in the hometown and try to find out, is this true? Is this ship is there? And then they took pictures to me, and then the story burst out. So I was really pissed off.
Evidence shows the work was done under permit and in partnership with a local university.
I have the copy of the letter from the University Sabah, Malaysia, from one of the university in Borneo. So they said they're actually doing the research. They got the approval from museum department in Kota Kinabalu. So they got the support letter from the marine team department as well. We all know that this is not the research. This is stealing the underwater heritage.
The extraordinary biodiversity of these Japanese wrecks drew tourists from around the world. Today, more than 95% of those ships are considered gone. Dozens of World War II sailors and crewmen lost their lives here. Their final resting place salvaged for scrap metal. A short while after being apprehended at sea, the MV Chuan Hong 68 suddenly disappears from Malaysian custody. Similar to the case of the HMAS Perth, the arresting authorities had no knowledge of the global agreement handed down by the United Nations and were therefore unaware the dredged steel was actually an internationally protected warship and gravesite. So the looters were captured, but later released.
The illegal salvage of these vessels is speeding up, and it was certainly very large between 2013 and 2019. And I think it was driven by the growing demand for these metals around the world. The prices were going through the roof. There's a huge demand for them.
At least 49 historical shipwrecks have been identified as damaged or entirely removed, potentially affecting thousands of World War II gravesites. Hundreds more are suspected of being damaged or are considered vulnerable.
Let's say that's your grandfather or your father or your uncle, and that's their remains, and they get hosed out of some scrap metal, then put in a bag and dumped somewhere. I'd be pretty upset, and I think the people who are upset about this have every reason to feel that way. Those remains need to be accorded respect, and they need to be interred. They need to be reburied in a way that's respectful.
Singaporean Dave Yu also feels the pain of these historical losses. A technical diver specializing in deep water, Dave has spent many years exploring these relics. with an eye towards HMS Repulse.
The Repulse, beautiful, with so much marine life that made the wreck their home. Watching her slowly getting bits and pieces eaten up by the salvages was just heartbreaking. As a Singaporean, I knew that the men of war who died on this wreck, they fought for our freedom during the war. And we couldn't do anything to preserve their final and resting place. You know, it's just unthinkable to say that the governments couldn't try harder to, preserve these two graves.
Authorities have refused to cooperate with Indonesian journalist Aquam Hanapan, and his investigation into human remains found at a scrapyard has hit a dead end. But his research has clearly shown that there was a network of salvagers targeting World War II warships and disturbing the graves of hundreds, if not thousands, of crewmen and sailors.
Perusahaan yang melakukan hal ini masih tetap bisa beroperasi, dan bahkan kapal-kapalnya pun masih tetap mendapat proyek dari pemerintah. Saya pikir polisi harus bersikap tegas, dalam artian menelusuri, kalau bisa sih menindak pelaku-pelaku ini.
Now, could this form of shipwreck destruction, looting, and grave robbing occur at the wreck site of the USS Johnston? Or how about the USS Samuel B. Roberts? Those famous shipwrecks are also located in Southeast Asia, in international waters east of the Philippines, just north of Indonesia, where these shipwrecked looters have been striking. It's easy to think that those wrecks at over 4 miles down are simply too deep. However, we must consider this. What makes this steel valuable? When was the steel used in the construction of those ships forged? When was it manufactured? Was it made before the era of the atomic bomb? If so, then we must assume scrap salvagers will consider that steel to be incredibly valuable. As a result, it won't be a matter of if, but rather when salvagers smell a potential profit and devise a way to target these historic and honored World War II shipwrecks. My name is Ken Stano. Thank you for checking out History X.